Thank you. Thank you very much. And I have to say, this is an extraordinary event. I had no idea that the size was going to be of the scale. But why would that be surprising after 60 years? I've got a date in my mind which will be engraved, I think, probably for the rest of my life. 19th of November, 2007. And that was the day I was sitting in a bedroom in a strange house, putting some clothing away in a wardrobe. Never been in the house there before. And there was a clutter in the passageway, and paws and claws, and 3 boisterous young golden retrievers were released into the house. And one of them made a beeline for my room, and he came storming into the room, took one look at me, came up to me, put his head on my lap, and wagged the longest tail I've ever seen on an e-dog. And I just met my first guide dog, Barkley. And I know it's a cliche, but I have to tell you that there is no way other than to say that there's no question that he changed my life. He quite literally changed my life. Before I had acquired Barkley, I was a user of a white cane, and I must admit, not a terribly good one either. I was poorly trained simply because there is a dearth of O&M instructors in the country, let alone in Cape Town. And finding one was not nearly as easy as you would imagine. In fact, there was an incident which was the catalyst to why I realized I needed O&M training in the first place. And this is about 1998. And my wife had asked me to go and get some headache tablets for her. She had a terrible migraine. And I said, no problem. And I, like many blind people or visually impaired people, I had a bit of vision. Most of us do. And I bounced off the walls all the way down the road to the chemist where I knew it was, confidently walking, albeit blundering into things here and there, convinced still that I was sighted enough to get around. It's a classic mistake. It's called passing. Many blind people have been encouraged to pass. Passing means you literally pretend that you don't have a problem. And I was a consummate passer. And as you can see from my hairline, this is not genetics. This is from walking into stuff, okay? Anyway, so I went into the chemist's shop, and I was confident that I'd be able to get around. Now, there's a little known fact that the blind spend less than you sighted people, simply because we don't browse. We don't walk into a shop and check out stuff we don't need and usually buy, okay? We destination shop. We destination shop. We go into a shop and we buy what we want. But we also struggle to find those things usually. And so there is no doubt that we need help, literally, because we do need to find some assistant who will be willing to give us a hand as to where the stock is, etc. Anyway, I walked into the chemist shop confident that I would manage because I knew the shop. I'd been there many times before, and I was confident that I would walk straight up to the counter, ask the individual to give me a hand. I walked into the shop, and it was completely different. They had changed the entire layout of the shop. And I had no idea what the hell was going on. And I actually, for a long time, thought perhaps I wasn't in the right shop. I have been known to do this. I remember walking, as a younger man, I walked into an adult sex shop. And I strolled confidently up to the counter that I could see in the gloom of my remaining vision, and I said to the lady there, "Can I have a donut?" And she looked at me balefully and said, "What precisely do you want to do with the donut?" But apart from that, I went into the chemist shop, looking around, desperately trying to find some landmark that I could pin down to ask somebody. And I saw a gleam of white up in front. And I knew that our pharmacist always wore a white coat, and I presumed it was him. And I strolled confidently towards him, and he quite literally disappeared before my eyes. He just literally dropped out of sight with a rather astounding crash, I might add. And I thought, oh my God, I've killed my pharmacist. And I bent down, and just in luck, he turned out to be a cardboard cutout of a pharmacist. And the most embarrassing thing was that what he was holding, this cardboard cutout, was a tray with hundreds and hundreds of brightly colored condoms that were now flying all over the shop. And it was on that day I went out of the chemist shop without the headache tablets and decided that I was being rather silly and to grow up a little and to get myself some O&M training. I did after a fashion. For 8 years I used a cane. Then came November 2007, and I got the dog. And what a difference. What a difference. I can tell you very honestly that my business started improving, interestingly. Before I was nervous to get around. Although I could get around after a fashion with the cane, I didn't particularly like catching a train, going to town and trying to find my way to the client. And the moment I got Barclay, things changed. Gail, who was my trainer, showed me some routes, and I was now delighted to climb into the train, storm off to town, hang a left to go down under Golden Acre, hang a right to go to Civic Centre, go straight towards Hadley Street. And I knew town anywhere, more or less. I've got an excellent GPS in my head. And so finding my way around was really no longer a big deal. I found, too, that Barclay became an ideal deal closer in business. In fact, I've always said I owe guide dog commission, I think, by now. But one of the things that I've found I have to do is to travel a lot. I spend a lot of time flying up to Joburg or Durban or PE or Bloem or anywhere, really. And I was very nervous at first, but it's after the first 3, 4, 5, dozen, 20, 50, 100, 200, 300, now 350 flights. Barclay is so cool with this thing. He really, really doesn't mind at all. And so he's a pleasure to take on the plane. But what I want to say about that is that of the 350 odd flights, give or take a dozen, I have never once had a single problem from any of the airlines. Barclay has been welcomed by every single flight without the slightest hesitation, which is an ironic indictment in a sense, because the most accessible form of public transport in our country turns out to be airlines, which is hardly for the masses. So it's an irony, really, but for which I am grateful. Having a dog, of course, exposes us to some of the things that us guide dog owners can all relate to. And of course, the age-old one, and I'm sure I'm a newbie compared to some of you guys, but I'm sure we all can relate to this, are the security guards who say, you can't bring your dog in here. It's interesting, it's never, ever the business, I believe. I don't believe it's ever the real business. It's usually some security guard or some front official who missed the lecture on guide dogs actually being allowed. But the funniest one that happened to me was I went into a building and I was hit by a rather strident voice, very confidently saying, no, sir, you may not come in with your dog. And as I do with every one of these incidents, instead of getting angry, I smile. And I walk forward closer to them and I smile, somewhat threateningly, it's true, but I do smile. And I say, it's fine. He's a guide dog. He can come in, trust me. And this chap turned around and said, no, sir, it doesn't matter what breed of dog it is. He still can't come in. I kid you not. But I want to end with a little sideline about blindness in general. It amazes me, once again, it's an indictment in the way that we respond to blindness in this country and in the world, is that we are still, regardless of the fact that there are so many highly competent, well-employed blind people, we have enormous skill. We have lawyers, advocates, CEOs, advocates who become CEOs, tax specialists, advocates who become CEOs and then tax specialists. We've had dramatists, poets, writers, musicians, that too. We've had every social workers, occupational therapists. We've had every conceivable kind of CAs. We've had every kind of intellectual capital. And yet, people still say, do you work? Or they still assume that you don't, in fact, perform some sort of proper economic thing. And a little story I want to end with, which will highlight this need for a paradigm shift, of the way that people are still obsessed with thinking in old-fashioned terms of what we can't do, they believe. I have an unusual hobby, and I've had it all my life, most of my life, is I'm a very good woodworker. I'm something of an amateur carpenter, and I'm fairly good. And I'm very fond of woodwork, and I'm pretty good at DIY, and I'll fix anything, and I like making furniture and things. And so with all that comes the commensurate tools. There are the saws and the drills, and then there's the hammers and the chisels and the files, and the planes, and then there's the electrical tools, there's the jigsaws and the electric planes, and the belt sanders and the orbital sanders and the desktop sanders. And then, of course, there's the saw, the bench saw. And I'm competent in all these tools. It's not a big deal. If you will, taught in the beginning. My old man taught me when I was a pup. And he said to me, it must have been about 8. He said, listen, boy, learn to respect the tool, and it'll be fine. If you're frightened of the tool, it will bite you. And so I took that lesson, and I'm now a very happy handyman carpenter chap. Anyway, one day I was working, and I had to rebuild a window. In fact, I had to remake a window. My window in my office had rotted, and I physically had to make another window. A window is not rocket science. It really isn't. It's 4 pieces of wood with a rebase. It's really not a big deal. Anyway, so I lined up the wood, and I measured it. Oh, by the way, I couldn't do any of these things without my trusty talking tape measure. I kid you not. My talking tape measure and my talking spirit level are the reason I can be competent. Anyway, I used the tape measure at 35 mils, no problem, and I put out the guide, and I lined up the piece of wood, and I cut, and something didn't feel right. And then I took the wood away, and I looked at it again, and I measured it, and the one end said 35 mils, and the bottom end said 22 mils. I mean, it was completely skew. You'd think a blind guy had cut it. It was ridiculous. And I thought, what the hell? I mean, this is not the way it's supposed to be. And I looked at my guide, and I looked at the saw, and I looked at the blade, and I didn't understand it, and I did another piece of wood. This is now expensive Meranti. Did another piece of wood, and it was just even worse. 35 mils on the one end, 18 mils on the other end. Could throw it away. There was nothing I could do with the wood. Oh, my heavens, now what? So I went to my local mica, who I know very well, and in there's a wonderful technician I've got to know. And I brought him over to my house, and I said, Patrick, what the hell's going on there? And he looked at it, and he spent about half an hour on the saw, and he found out the problem. The riffing blade behind the blade was propellant. It was skew. He took it off. He straightened it right there and then in my workshop. But a very big, broad vise, and he was able to beat it straight on that. And he put it back in the saw. He himself cut a piece of wood, cut sweetly, beautifully. He then steps back. And I said, okay, I'm going to try it now. And you know, I could smell the man's fear. He was standing there, and I measured my guide. I took out a piece of good Meranti, and I measured it 35 mils. I turned the saw on. I leaned down, much like a snooker player does, and I leaned down. And I tell you, I couldn't do it. Eh? The tension in the room was palpable. So I sat up, and I was tempted to say to him, listen, boy, step back, because blood's hard to wipe off. But I turned the saw off, and I said, Patrick, are you frightened? He says, sir, I'm shitting myself. Excuse me, that's a woodworking technical term. And he says, no, I'm shitting myself. I said, Patrick, relax, pal. Now listen here. Have you ever actually seen anybody who's cut their hands off or their fingers off? He says, what? I've been in this business 40 years. I've lost count of the number of fingers and hands I've seen cut off. I said, now think, Patrick. Were any of those people blind? And he said, no. I said, well, there's your problem. Happy birthday, Guide Dog. Thank you.